The HOA Karen ruthlessly cut down all my trees, but she didn't know I was a federal judge. The silence on Havenwood Drive was unnatural, a heavy, suffocating blanket draped over manicured lawns and pristine houses. Judge Michael Thompson slowed his car, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He'd left for court that morning with the usual comforting image of his home in his mind, the stately colonial embraced by the lush green canopy of his ancient trees. Now, as he rounded the corner, a scene of shocking devastation assaulted him. Where towering oaks and graceful maples had stood for generations, there was only nothing. Jagged stumps, like raw, gaping wounds, dotted his property. The air, thick with the scent of sawdust and fresh-cut wood, screamed of violation. Who would do this, and why? The question echoed in his mind, mingling with a rising tide of outrage that threatened to consume him. This wasn't just landscaping, it was a declaration of war. Judge Michael Thompson had always believed in two things: the unwavering power of the law and the enduring beauty of nature. He'd spent his career upholding the former, serving with distinction on the federal bench for over 20 years. His evenings, and especially his weekends, were dedicated to the latter, spent nurturing the sanctuary he'd created on his 2-acre property just outside of the bustling city of Oak Ridge. Retirement hadn't changed that. If anything, it had deepened his commitment to both. His home, a classic 2-story colonial with weathered brick and crisp white trim, wasn't ostentatious. It was comfortable, solid, a reflection of the man himself. But it was the land surrounding the house that truly held his heart. In particular, it was the trees. Towering oaks, their gnarled branches reaching towards the sky like ancient arms. Graceful maples, their leaves a fiery spectacle in the autumn. And a pair of majestic southern pines, their needles whispering secrets in the breeze. These weren't just trees, they were living monuments, silent witnesses to decades of history. Some had been planted by the original owners of the property, back when Oak Ridge was little more than a farming community. Others had sprouted naturally, nurtured by the rich soil and the gentle climate. Michael had carefully tended to them all, ensuring they had the space, the nutrients, and the protection they needed to thrive. He knew their names, their quirks, their individual personalities. He'd often sit on his porch swing, a glass of iced tea in hand, simply admiring their grandeur. They offered shade in the scorching summer months, a vibrant canvas of color in the fall, and a stark, elegant beauty in the winter. They were his constant companions, a source of peace and solace in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. He'd even had a small, discreet plaque installed at the base of the oldest oak, engraved with a quote from John Muir. "In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks." The Havenwood Homeowners Association, or HOA, as it was universally known, had always been a low hum of annoyance in the background of Michael's otherwise tranquil existence. He understood the need for some community standards, a way to maintain property values and ensure a degree of harmony. But Havenwood, under the increasingly iron-fisted rule of its president, Karen Mitchell, seemed to have taken those principles to an absurd extreme. He'd heard the whispers from neighbors, complaints about overly strict rules, arbitrary fines, and a general atmosphere of micromanagement. Mrs. Henderson next door had been cited for having a bird feeder that was not in compliance with approved avian sustenance devices. Mr. Johnson, across the street, had received a warning about the color of his mailbox. Apparently, colonial blue was acceptable, but Williamsburg blue was not. Michael had mostly managed to avoid direct conflict. He paid his dues, kept his lawn neatly mowed, though he refused to use the HOA-approved eco-green fertilizer, which he suspected was mostly sawdust and generally kept to himself. He believed in picking his battles, and, frankly, he had more important things to worry about than the color of his mailbox. Karen Mitchell, on the other hand, seemed to have nothing but time to worry about such things. She was a woman of a certain age, perhaps in her late 50s, with a tightly permed helmet of blonde hair, a wardrobe that consisted primarily of brightly colored pantsuits, and a demeanor that could best be described as aggressively cheerful. She had a way of smiling that didn't quite reach her eyes, and a voice that dripped with condescension, even when she was ostensibly being polite. She'd been president of the Havenwood HOA for 5 years running, and during that time, she'd transformed it from a relatively benign organization into a miniature fiefdom, ruling over the neighborhood with a combination of petty rules and passive-aggressive enforcement. She patrolled the streets in her pristine white Lexus SUV, her eyes constantly scanning for violations: a misplaced garbage can, an overgrown hedge, a garden gnome that dared to deviate from the approved aesthetic. She seemed to take a particular delight in issuing citations, those little yellow slips of paper that carried the weight of officialdom and the sting of disapproval. Michael had received a few himself, mostly for minor infractions like leaving his garden hose uncoiled for too long. He'd paid the fines, more out of a desire to avoid confrontation than any sense of guilt. He considered it a small price to pay for maintaining his privacy and his sanity. That all changed on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. Michael had spent the morning in court, presiding over a complex patent dispute. It had been a long, intellectually demanding day, and he was looking forward to returning home, unwinding with a good book and enjoying the cool shade of his trees. As he turned onto his street, he felt a sense of unease. Something was off. The familiar canopy of green that usually greeted him was gone. He blinked, thinking perhaps he'd taken a wrong turn. But no, this was his street, his house, and his trees. His trees were gone. He pulled into his driveway, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped out of his car, his legs feeling strangely weak. The scene that greeted him was one of utter devastation. The oaks, the maples, the pines, all of them had been brutally cut down. Not pruned, not trimmed, destroyed. Stumps, jagged and raw, were all that remained, scattered across his yard like tombstones in a freshly dug graveyard. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and the bitter tang of resin. Branches and leaves lay piled haphazardly, a chaotic mess where once there had been order and beauty. His meticulously maintained landscape, his sanctuary, had been reduced to a wasteland. It looked like a logging operation had gone berserk, leaving nothing but carnage in its wake. The silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of birds, seemingly confused and disoriented by the sudden absence of their homes. Michael stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend the scale of the destruction. It wasn't just the loss of the trees, it was the violation, the sheer audacity of it all. Someone had come onto his property, without his permission, without any warning, and deliberately destroyed something he cherished. This wasn't an accident, this was an act of war. The sun, which had been shining brightly just moments before, now seemed to be casting long, accusing shadows across the ravaged landscape. The initial shock gave way to a wave of grief, raw and visceral. Michael felt a physical ache in his chest, a tightening in his throat. He walked slowly among the wreckage, touching the rough, splintered wood of a severed oak branch, the delicate, still green leaves of a maple, now destined to wither and die. He'd planted some of those trees himself years ago, small saplings that he'd nurtured and watched grow into majestic giants. They were more than just landscaping. They were a connection to the past, a living legacy. He'd envisioned his grandchildren climbing those branches, building tree houses in their sturdy limbs. Now all that remained were memories and the gaping wounds in the earth. He ran a hand over the smooth, cold surface of a stump, tracing the rings that marked the years of its life. Each ring represented a season, a cycle of growth and dormancy, a testament to the tree's resilience. And now that life had been abruptly and violently ended, not by natural causes, but by deliberate human action. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to regain control. He was a federal judge, a man of reason and logic. He dealt with complex issues, with matters of law and justice, every day. He couldn't afford to succumb to blind rage. But the anger was there, simmering beneath the surface, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. It wasn't the uncontrolled, explosive anger of a hothead. It was the focused, calculated fury of a man who had been deeply wronged and was determined to seek redress. He spotted a glint of white in the distance, parked halfway down the block, Karen Mitchell's Lexus. It was unmistakable, gleaming like a predator's tooth in the afternoon sun. She was still here. He started walking towards the vehicle, his pace deliberate, his jaw set. He wouldn't shout, he wouldn't threaten. He would simply confront. As he approached, Karen emerged from the passenger side, her expression a carefully crafted mask of polite concern. "Judge Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with that signature false sweetness. "I'm so glad I caught you. We were just overseeing some necessary landscape adjustments." "Adjustments?" Michael's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried an undercurrent of steel. "You call this adjustments?" He gestured towards the devastation behind him. Karen blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "Well, the trees were non-compliant with the Havenwood HOA landscaping guidelines. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3 specifically states, "I don't give a damn about section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3, Michael interrupted, his voice still controlled, but gaining intensity. "You entered my property without my permission and destroyed my trees. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Karen's smile returned, this time with a hint of smugness. "The HOA has the authority to maintain community aesthetics, Judge Thompson. It's all in the bylaws. Your trees were, well, they were becoming rather unruly. They were blocking the sightlines, casting excessive shade, and frankly, they didn't fit in with the overall landscape design of Havenwood." "The overall landscape design?" Michael repeated, incredulous. "This isn't a golf course, Mrs. Mitchell. It's my home, and those were my trees. You had no right." "We sent you several notices," Karen insisted, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "We gave you ample opportunity to comply." Michael remembered the notices, flimsy pieces of paper, filled with bureaucratic jargon and veiled threats. He'd tossed them in the recycling bin, dismissing them as the petty annoyances of a power-hungry HOA. He'd never imagined they would escalate to this. "Those notices were meaningless," Michael said. "I never signed any agreement subjecting my property to your arbitrary rules. My deed predates the establishment of this HOA, and there's a clear legal precedent." He stopped himself, realizing he was starting to argue legal points with a woman who clearly had no understanding of or respect for the law. "Now, Judge Thompson, let's not be dramatic," Karen said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just a few trees. We can arrange for some replacements, something more suitable, perhaps some nice uniform Bradford pears. They're very popular." That was the breaking point. The mention of Bradford pears, those notoriously weak and short-lived trees, often planted in sterile cookie-cutter developments, was the final insult. Michael took a step closer, his eyes locking with Karen's. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was chilling. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "you have made a grave mistake. You have violated my property, you have destroyed something precious to me, and you have done so with a breathtaking level of arrogance and disregard for the law. I assure you, you will regret this." Karen's smile finally vanished completely. Her face paled slightly, and a flicker of uncertainty appeared in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I am a federal judge," Michael continued, his voice low and steady. "I understand the law, and I intend to use it to its fullest extent to hold you and the Havenwood HOA accountable for your actions." He turned and walked back towards his house, leaving Karen standing there, speechless, and for the first time, visibly shaken. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew that this was just the beginning. The anger was still there, but it was now channeled, focused, transformed into a steely resolve. He had a plan, and he would execute it with the same precision and dedication he had brought to his legal career. Karen Mitchell had picked the wrong fight with the wrong man at the wrong time. Judge Michael Thompson's home office was a sanctuary of order and intellect. Leather-bound law books lined the walls reaching from floor to ceiling. A large mahogany desk, polished to a mirror sheen, dominated the room, its surface uncluttered save for a meticulously organized stack of legal pads and a vintage fountain pen. This was where he retreated to think, to analyze, to strategize. And now it was where he would prepare for battle. He began, as he always did, with the law. He pulled out his copy of the state statutes, the local ordinances, and the Havenwood HOA bylaws, which he'd retrieved with some disgust from the recycling bin. He spent hours poring over the documents, his experienced eye scanning for loopholes, contradictions, and violations. He highlighted passages, made notes in the margins, and cross-referenced different sections. He was building a case, brick by legal brick, He quickly confirmed his initial suspicion. The HOA's actions were not only egregious, but also blatantly illegal. Several state laws protected mature trees, requiring permits and environmental impact assessments before any removal could take place, especially on private property. The local ordinances were even stricter, reflecting the community's growing awareness of the importance of preserving its green spaces. The HOA had violated both, flagrantly and without remorse. Then there was the matter of the HOA's authority, or lack thereof. Michael pulled out his property deed, a document dating back to the 1950s, long before Havenwood even existed. He carefully examined the language, searching for any mention of restrictive covenants or easements that might bind his property to the HOA. He found none. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible difference in the wording used to describe the boundaries of his lot compared to the later developed lots within Havenwood. It was a technicality, a detail that most people would have overlooked. But Michael was not most people. He was a federal judge, trained to spot the nuances, the hidden meanings, the legal loopholes. This seemingly minor difference meant that his property was, in fact, not legally part of the Havenwood HOA. He was not bound by their rules, their regulations, or their ridiculous landscaping guidelines. Karen Mitchell had trespassed, vandalized his property, and acted with complete impunity based on a fundamentally flawed assumption. While the legal violations were clear, Michael knew that a strong case needed more than just legal arguments. It needed evidence, and it needed allies. He started documenting everything. He took dozens of photos of the destroyed trees, the stumps, the piles of debris. He retrieved the security camera footage from the system he'd installed a few years earlier, primarily to deter package thieves, not HOA presidents. The footage clearly showed Karen Mitchell's SUV arriving, followed by a truck carrying several workers with chainsaws. It showed the workers cutting down the trees, methodically and without hesitation. It was damning evidence, captured in high-definition video. He then turned his attention to the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, even one not technically bound by their authority, he had the right to inspect their financial records. He submitted a formal request citing the relevant state laws. He knew Karen Mitchell would likely try to obstruct him, to delay, to obfuscate. But he was prepared for that. He had anticipated her every move. He had already drafted a follow-up letter, threatening legal action if she failed to comply within the legally mandated time frame. While he was waiting for the HOA's response, or lack thereof, Michael started reaching out to his network of contacts. He called David Miller, a former colleague and a highly respected environmental lawyer. David listened to Michael's story, his voice growing increasingly incredulous. He confirmed Michael's legal assessment and offered to provide expert testimony, pro bono, if the case went to court. "That woman's a menace, Michael," David said. "She needs to be stopped." Next, Michael contacted Sarah Chen, a forensic accountant he'd worked with on several complex fraud cases during his time on the bench. Sarah was known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to uncover financial irregularities that others missed. He explained the situation, hinting at his suspicions about the HOA's finances. Sarah was intrigued. "HOAs can be a goldmine for embezzlement," she said. "They often operate with little oversight, and the residents are usually too busy or too intimidated to challenge them." She agreed to take a look at the HOA's records, once Michael obtained them. Finally, Michael reached out to an old friend, Tom Bradley, a reporter for the Oak Ridge Gazette. Tom was a seasoned journalist, with a reputation for digging up dirt and exposing corruption. He'd covered several HOA scandals in the past, and he knew the power of public opinion. Michael laid out the facts, carefully avoiding any mention of his own involvement, presenting it as a potential story of community abuse and legal overreach. Tom was immediately hooked. "A federal judge's trees cut down by a rogue HOA, Karen Mitchell? This is front-page material, Michael. Absolutely front page." With his allies assembled, his evidence gathered, and his legal arguments honed, Judge Michael Thompson felt a sense of calm determination. He was no longer just a grieving homeowner. He was a seasoned legal warrior, armed with the weapons of knowledge, experience, and a network of powerful connections. Karen Mitchell had thought she could get away with her petty tyranny. She had underestimated her opponent. She had awakened a sleeping giant. And now, she would face the consequences. The battle was about to begin. Sarah Chen, the forensic accountant, worked with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned surgeon. Armed with the HOA's financial records, finally pried loose from Karen Mitchell's reluctant grasp after a strongly worded letter from Judge Thompson threatening immediate legal action, she delved into the numbers. She spent days in Michael's home office surrounded by stacks of bank statements, invoices, and receipts, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. Michael provided coffee and sandwiches, occasionally peering over her shoulder, but mostly leaving her to her work. He trusted her expertise implicitly. After 3 days, Sarah emerged, her expression grim. "You were right, Michael," she said. "This is worse than I thought. It's not just petty embezzlement, it's a full-blown scheme." She proceeded to lay out her findings, meticulously documented in a detailed report. There were inflated invoices from landscaping companies that didn't exist, payments to consultants with no clear job descriptions, and large sums of money transferred to personal accounts linked to Karen Mitchell and 2 other members of the HOA board. The pattern was clear. Karen and her cronies had been systematically looting the HOA's funds for years, using the residents' dues to finance their own lavish lifestyles. The total amount embezzled was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They were clever, Sarah admitted, but not clever enough. They used multiple shell corporations and offshore accounts, but I was able to trace the money back to them. They left a trail, Michael, a very clear trail. Michael nodded, his expression hardening. He wasn't surprised, but the sheer scale of the fraud was still shocking. He had suspected corruption, but this was organized crime, operating under the guise of a neighborhood association. Meanwhile, Tom Bradley, the reporter from the Oakbridge Gazette, was busy digging up his own dirt. He interviewed dozens of Havenwood residents, carefully cultivating sources and gathering anecdotes about Karen Mitchell's reign of terror. He heard stories of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and a general atmosphere of fear and intimidation. He discovered that several residents had tried to challenge Karen in the past, but they had been silenced, ostracized, or simply worn down by her relentless pressure. He also uncovered a history of complaints filed against the Havenwood HOA with the city and the state, all of which had been mysteriously dismissed or ignored. Tom's investigation led him to a former HOA board member, a retired accountant named Harold Peterson, who had resigned in protest several years earlier. Harold was initially reluctant to talk, fearing retaliation from Karen. But Tom, with his persuasive charm and his promise of anonymity, eventually convinced him to share his story. Harold confirmed Sarah Chen's findings, providing further details about the financial irregularities and Karen's manipulative tactics. He also revealed that Karen had a close relationship with a city council member, a man named Richard "Dick" Sterling, who had consistently blocked any attempts to investigate the HOA. Armed with this information, Michael contacted the city council member he knew, Susan Ramirez. Susan was a relatively new member of the council, known for her integrity and her commitment to transparency. She had run on a platform of reforming local government, and she had already made enemies with some of the more entrenched, old-guard politicians, including Dick Sterling. Michael laid out the evidence he had gathered, presenting her with Sarah Chen's report, Tom Bradley's findings, and his own legal analysis. He explained the jurisdictional issue, emphasizing that his property was not legally bound by the HOA's rules. Susan was outraged. She had heard rumors about the Havenwood HOA, but she had never seen concrete proof of such widespread corruption. She promised Michael her full support. She would use her position on the council to call for a formal investigation, and she would work to ensure that Karen Mitchell and her accomplices were held accountable. She also agreed to quietly alert the state attorney general's office, bypassing Dick Sterling's influence. With the wheels of justice slowly turning, Michael focused on building his legal case. He drafted a comprehensive complaint outlining the HOA's multiple violations: the illegal tree removal, the breach of contract, or rather the lack of a valid contract, the financial fraud, and the violation of his civil rights. He named Karen Mitchell, the other complicit board members, and the Havenwood HOA itself as defendants. He calculated the damages, including the value of the trees, the cost of remediation, and punitive damages for the intentional and malicious nature of their actions. The total amount was substantial. He also began organizing the Havenwood residents. He held informal meetings in his living room, now sadly lacking its leafy view, sharing his findings and encouraging his neighbors to join the fight. He explained their legal rights, reassured them that they were not alone, and empowered them to speak out. At first, many were hesitant, still intimidated by Karen Mitchell's power. But as they saw Michael's determination and the mounting evidence against her, they began to find their voices. They signed petitions, wrote letters to the city council, and shared their own stories of HOA abuse. A groundswell of resistance was building. Finally, Michael prepared 2 legal documents: a formal complaint to the state attorney general's office, detailing the financial crimes and requesting a criminal investigation, and a civil lawsuit against Karen Mitchell and the HOA, seeking compensation for the damages and a permanent injunction preventing them from ever harassing him or entering his property again. He reviewed the documents one last time, ensuring that every detail was perfect. Every legal argument airtight. He was ready. He had built his case, brick by painstaking brick. He had gathered his arsenal of legal weapons, expert testimony, and community support. Now it was time for the reckoning. Karen Mitchell had thought she was untouchable. She was about to learn otherwise. The federal judge was not just seeking justice. He was seeking to dismantle her entire corrupt empire. The Havenwood HOA annual meeting was usually a sparsely attended affair, a tedious recitation of budgets and bylaws, punctuated by polite applause and the occasional rubber chicken dinner. This year, however, was different. Word of Judge Thompson's impending confrontation with Karen Mitchell had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. The community room at the Havenwood clubhouse was packed, every seat filled, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air crackled with anticipation, a mixture of fear and excitement. Karen Mitchell, dressed in a power suit that seemed a size too small, stood at the podium, her usual smug smile replaced by a tight, strained expression. She attempted to start the meeting with the usual platitudes about community spirit and property values, but she was quickly drowned out by a chorus of murmurs and whispers. She banged the gavel, her knuckles white, but the unrest continued. Judge Thompson sat quietly in the front row, his presence radiating a calm authority. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, his demeanor professional and composed. He had brought with him a stack of documents, neatly organized in a leather briefcase. He was not there to make a scene. He was there to present a case. When it was time for new business, Michael stood up. The room fell silent. "Madam President," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "I have a matter to bring before the board and the residents of Havenwood." Karen Mitchell attempted to interrupt him, citing some obscure procedural rule, but Michael ignored her. He walked to the front of the room, placing his briefcase on a table. He addressed the assembled residents, not Karen. "For years," he began, "this HOA has operated under a veil of secrecy and intimidation. Rules have been enforced selectively, funds have been mismanaged, and residents have been silenced. Today, that ends." He then proceeded to systematically dismantle Karen Mitchell's regime, piece by piece. He presented the evidence he had gathered: the security camera footage of the illegal tree removal, the forensic accountant's report detailing the embezzlement, the legal analysis demonstrating that his property was not even subject to the HOA's jurisdiction, and the sworn statements from neighbors detailing Karen's abusive behavior. He spoke calmly, methodically, laying out the facts like a prosecutor presenting a closing argument. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't resort to personal attacks. He simply let the evidence speak for itself. With each new revelation, the gasps and murmurs in the room grew louder. Karen Mitchell sat at the podium, her face a mask of fury and disbelief. She tried to interject, to deny the accusations, to claim that it was all a misunderstanding. But her words were lost in the growing tide of outrage. "And finally," Michael said, holding up a copy of the lawsuit he had filed, "I am pursuing legal action against the Havenwood HOA and against Karen Mitchell personally for trespass, property damage, financial fraud, and violation of my civil rights. He then revealed his position, for added weight and to underscore the seriousness. As a federal judge, I cannot and will not stand for this clear injustice and blatant disregard for the rule of law. The room erupted. Residents shouted questions, demanded answers, and called for Karen Mitchell's immediate resignation. Several people openly wept, relieved that someone had finally stood up to her. Tom Bradley, the reporter from the Oak Ridge Gazette, was in the back of the room, furiously scribbling notes. He had a front-page story, and he knew it. Susan Ramirez, the city council member, was also present, observing the proceedings with a grim satisfaction. She had already alerted the state attorney general's office, and investigators were en route. Karen Mitchell, realizing that she had lost control, attempted one last desperate maneuver. She grabbed the microphone and shouted, "This is all a lie. He's just a disgruntled homeowner. He's trying to destroy our community." But her words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Several residents stood up and demanded her resignation. The other board members, sensing the shift in power, remained silent, their faces pale. They knew they were next. The meeting descended into chaos. Karen Mitchell, her face contorted with rage, stormed out of the room, followed by her two remaining loyalists on the board. The residents, emboldened by Michael's actions, began to organize themselves. They elected a temporary steering committee to oversee the HOA's operations and to cooperate with the authorities. Within days, the state attorney general's office launched a full-scale investigation into the Havenwood HOA. Karen Mitchell's bank accounts were frozen, her passport was seized, and she was placed under house arrest, pending formal charges. The other board members who had been complicit in the financial fraud were also arrested. The Oak Ridge Gazette ran a series of front-page stories exposing the scandal, making Karen Mitchell a local pariah. The civil lawsuit proceeded swiftly. Given the overwhelming evidence and Judge Thompson's standing, the HOA's insurance company quickly offered a substantial settlement, which Michael accepted. He used the funds to replant his trees, choosing a variety of native species that would provide even greater beauty and biodiversity than before. He also donated a portion of the settlement to a local environmental charity. The Havenwood HOA was placed under state receivership. The remaining uninvolved board members were replaced with a new, interim board elected by the residents, with a mandate to reform the organization's bylaws and restore transparency and accountability. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed dramatically. The fear and intimidation were gone, replaced by a sense of community and cooperation. Neighbors started talking to each other again, sharing stories, and working together to rebuild their community. Judge Michael Thompson, standing in his newly replanted yard, watched the sunset, the golden light filtering through the young leaves of his new trees. He felt a sense of profound satisfaction. He had fought for his property, for his rights, and for his community. He had used his knowledge and his position, not for personal gain, but to uphold the principles of justice and fairness. He had won not just a legal battle, but a moral victory. The trees were gone, yes, but in their place, something stronger had grown. A renewed sense of community, a commitment to justice, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that even the most entrenched power could be challenged and overcome. And perhaps most importantly, he'd taught Karen Mitchell a lesson she wouldn't soon forget.